It sounded like a great idea when we first came up with it. People had been warning us for years, easy on the butter, it's fattening. So we found a way, we thought, to get everything we wanted. All the deliciousness of butter without any of the fat. Someone came up with the idea, why don't we just pump a bunch of hydrogen into vegetable oil? And then it'll be whipped kind of like butter. And we can put it on our toast, and we can have, as they told us in the commercials for margarine, all the buttery taste with none of the fat. That led to the fat-free 80s. Remember the 1980s? There was no fat in anything. You could have whatever you wanted. They found a way to make it all fat-free. So we were really disappointed when, a decade or two later, all the doctors said, we've been running the numbers, and it turns out you should go back to butter. This margarine thing is not working out. And so now they tell us butter, again, is the way. That whole situation came about because of this human desire that we all have to want all of the good without any of the bad. We want life to deliver us only the good things and have none of the bad things that go with it. So we love the taste of chocolate cake, but we like the way eating broccoli makes us feel. So we're trying to figure out always, how can we have the taste of the cake with the nutrition of the broccoli? And that's what we're hearing about in this story Jesus tells us about farming. There are weeds popping up in the field. And the only person who isn't surprised by that is the master farmer. The servants are like, what's going on? We only sowed good seed. Why are we having to deal with these weeds? And the farmer is calm. He knows there were going to be weeds in the field. They say, do you want us to rip up all the weeds? And he says, no. He gives the incredible answer, no. It'll actually make things worse. Let them grow, and we'll deal with them later. Why would he say that? The weeds represent chaos. And every time we think we've got it going pretty well, chaos rears its head. And I don't need to give you a bunch of examples. You're thinking of your own life right now. Every time things start to go pretty well, a little bit of chaos comes in the picture. Chaos is like an invasive species in the garden. Every time you've got everything figured out, just like a game of whack-a-mole, a little bit of chaos pops up, and you got to deal with it. There's no way around it. This week, we're doing a deep dive into the topic of infrastructure. And the readings are perfect for this week because we're getting a glimpse into the divine infrastructure, how life works, how it's all designed. And the short-term news is not that good. The short-term news is chaos is here to stay. It's an invasive species. It is going to be in the garden, and we are going to have to deal with it. All of the vain hopes we might have, maybe we're getting ahead of chaos. Maybe we're mastering it. Nope, we're not. It is an invasive species that is part of this journey. It is in the garden to stay. But the long-term news is much better. And that is that in God's infrastructure, there's an order beyond the chaos. The chaos is here and it's real, but there's an order that keeps things together beyond the chaos that we experience. And we're called to be humble and to accept that order and to place ourselves at the service of that greater order that is beyond the chaos. When we're not ripping out the weeds anymore, we start to be able to look at how much we've tried to engineer the troubles out of life. We thought we could engineer the fat out of butter, but it can't really be done without making things worse. When we tried to engineer the fat out of butter, we created a society that was fatter and sicker than it was before we did that. So now we're realizing that the real secret to dealing with the weeds in butter is to use it sparingly, to know that it's wonderful. It is going to make your cornbread so much better than if you eat it dry. But don't put an inch of it on it, or you'll pay the price. You have to put just a little bit. And if you instead say, well, maybe I can put an inch of vegetable oil filled with hydrogen on it instead, and that'll be good. Well, we can't engineer life to be exactly the way we want it. The fat is going to be in the butter. And awareness is what God is calling us to. It is something that needs to be respected. If we know that, we can start to glimpse the order that is beyond the chaos. The band Queen was a world sensation for probably 20 years, and its lead singer, Freddie Mercury, was the main attraction. Freddie Mercury had a famous look that was not a very Hollywood way to look. He had a giant overbite, and his front two teeth bucked out even when he smiled. Most people considered that a weed in his garden. And because he was so rich and so famous, people would tell him all the time, just have surgery and fix that. You don't have to have your teeth look like that. You can get that all fixed. But he didn't do it. Freddie Mercury had a vocal range of 4 octaves, something that's just about unheard of in vocal music. And it turns out that the shape of his mouth facilitated some of his incredible vocal ability. If he had engineered the weed out of his garden, he might have disrupted everything and ripped up the wheat as well. He worked with what he had. And that is part of accepting the divine infrastructure of life. There's a famous story about a poor mother in India who lived with her children in a house with no running water. So every day, she had to walk down to the river to get water and bring it back to her kids. And she had one of those old-fashioned yokes, a wooden harness over her shoulders with 2 clay pots hanging by a rope for balance that she would bring down to the river empty and back up every day. One of her neighbors asked her one time why the path from her house to the river had flowers growing on only one side of the path. And the mother said, because one of my pots is cracked. And every time I bring the water up from the river in my 2 full pots, by the time I get to the house, one of them is half empty because half the water has poured out through the crack. And she said, I can't afford a new one. So I got some seeds and I planted them along the side of the path with the cracked pot. And it waters the seeds as I go up to my house. And then I cut the flowers and I put them on the temple every week at the altar to give glory to God. She works with what she has. Nobody wants a pot for carrying water that's cracked. But if that's what you have, you plant seeds along the path. She didn't have money for a new pot, and she didn't have money to go to the florist every week to bring flowers to the temple. But by working with the chaos that was in her life, the weed in her garden, she brought glory to God. So this week, it seems to me that we are being invited to name what is a weed in our garden that is here to stay. What is something maybe we've been hoping we were going to overcome, but we now are wise enough to know, I'm not going to get ahead of this. This is here to stay. It's an invasive species in my garden. What would it be that you could name and call a truce with? This is something I'm going to need to learn to live with. It's not going anywhere. I'm not going to be able to engineer all of the problems and flaws out of life. What is it that you need to work with instead of trying to overcome? What seeds do you need to plant along the path where your biggest flaw or weakness shows up? We have to admit that throughout our lives, we've been learning about the value of what we thought were weeds. When I was a kid, kale was never something you would eat. It was a garnish. Do you remember? If you went to the meat market, it was what they would put underneath the ground chuck to make it pop in the butcher case. At the very least, it was a little bit of color under the orange slice in the garnish on your plate. But now it's a superfood, and it's needed for everything. Who was it that first realized that those little red tumors that grow in your garden and taste like dirt would actually be the thing you would thinly slice at a 5-star restaurant and serve as the most elegant of salads? Who would know that that little weed, parsley, is what you need to make a good meatball? Or that other little weed, cilantro, is essential in salsa? We have to work with what we have in the garden. And we've learned the hard way. You can't take the fat out of butter. But you can be aware of butter's weaknesses. And only when we get to heaven will we maybe realize that all these weeds we're dealing with are an essential part, in some mysterious divine way, of what makes life so good.